The paper felt thin between my fingers. For a second I just stared at it, confused about how something so small could fall out of something so important. My mind tried to make sense of it before my heart could react. Maybe it was a prayer note. Maybe a verse reference. Maybe something harmless. I unfolded it slowly. I wish I hadn't rushed. I wish I had taken one more second before reading. Because once my eyes processed those words, there was no folding my life back the way it was. The handwriting was familiar. Not neat. Not rushed. Controlled. The kind of writing you use when you don't want to make a mistake. 3 words stood out clearly. No verses. No explanation. Just instruction. My chest tightened. I read it again. And again. Each time hoping the meaning would change. It didn't. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was denial. This has to mean something else. Has to. I looked around the room, half expecting someone to be watching me, like I had crossed into something I wasn't supposed to see. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I folded the paper back quickly and slid it into my pocket. My hands were shaking, but my mind kept trying to protect me. Maybe it's symbolic. Maybe it's a metaphor. Maybe I'm misunderstanding. That's what denial does. It gives you excuses when the truth feels too dangerous. When he came home that evening, I acted normal. Smiled. I asked about his day. I set the table. My heart was racing, but I kept my voice steady. I didn't want him to sense anything different. I didn't know why yet. I just knew I couldn't let him know I had seen that note. He kissed my forehead like always. And suddenly, that gesture felt unfamiliar. That night, I didn't confront him. I watched him. The way he moved through the house. The way he placed the Bible back on the shelf. The way he prayed, longer than usual. I noticed things I had never paid attention to before. How his jaw tightened when he thought I wasn't looking. How he paused before certain verses. How his calm felt rehearsed. And for the first time, a thought crossed my mind that terrified me. What if this wasn't new? What if it had been building for a long time? Right in front of me, even when your mind refuses to accept something, your body reacts. I couldn't sleep. Every sound felt louder. Every movement felt intentional. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying moments from the past. Conversations, arguments, silences, through a new lens. Things that once felt confusing now felt calculated. The next few days passed slowly. I kept the note hidden. I didn't look at it again, but I didn't throw it away either. Something told me I would need it, even if I didn't understand why yet. I started paying attention to patterns. What made him irritated? What made him calm? What made him watch me too closely? And the more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore the truth forming in my chest. I wasn't panicking. Not yet. Fear had settled into something quieter, something sharper. Awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because once you see clearly, you can't unsee it. I didn't change my routine. That was the first decision I made without even realizing it was a decision. I woke up at the same time. I made breakfast the same way. I asked him the same polite questions about his day. On the outside, nothing had shifted. But inside me, everything had. Carrying that note felt like carrying a second heart. One that beat faster, louder, and only when I was alone. I hid it carefully. Not in a drawer. Not somewhere obvious. I slipped it between old papers I knew he never touched. Wills. Manuals. Things he considered useless. Every time I passed that spot, my chest tightened. Because now I knew something he didn't know I knew. And that knowledge changed the balance of power in ways I didn't fully understand yet. When you stop feeling safe, you start observing. Not emotionally, strategically. I noticed how predictable he was. How his calm followed a schedule. How his moods lined up with certain triggers. He wasn't chaotic. He was controlled. And that scared me more than anger ever could. Anger explodes. Control waits. He read the Bible more intensely after that. Longer sessions. More notes. More underlining. Sometimes he'd pause, look at me and smile. Not warmly but knowingly. As if he was checking something off in his head. I began to realize the Bible wasn't just faith for him. It was justification that I tried something small. One evening I disagreed with him gently. Not about anything serious. Just a comment about plans for the weekend. The shift was instant. Not loud. Not violent. Just cold. He quoted a verse. Then another. Then reminded me calmly that a wise woman knows when to submit. My stomach dropped. That word, submit, had never felt so heavy before. Tonight, I replayed old moments in my head. Things I had brushed off. Times he discouraged me from working. Moments he isolated me for my own peace. Conversations where I ended up apologizing without knowing why. I used to think I was sensitive. Now I saw the pattern. Fear didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as caution. I stopped leaving my phone unlocked. I memorized routes instead of relying on GPS. I paid attention to doors, locks, timing. I started thinking in ifs. If I needed help. If something went wrong. If I had to leave fast. Those thoughts never used to exist. Now they lived with me. The hardest part wasn't pretending. It was swallowing my instincts. Every part of me wanted to ask questions, to confront, to demand answers. But something deeper told me, not yet, not until you understand the whole picture. So I stayed quiet. And in that quiet, I learned more than I ever had before. One afternoon, I stood near that shelf again. The Bible sat there, innocent and ordinary. Anyone walking into our home would see it and feel comforted. No one would imagine what had slipped out of it. No one would guess what was hidden inside our quiet life. Including me. Just weeks earlier, I wasn't imagining things anymore. That was the biggest shift. For the first time, I trusted myself more than the image he showed the world. And that trust, fragile as it was, became the beginning of something dangerous. Hope that I didn't know how I would leave. I didn't know when. I didn't even know if I could. All I knew was this. That note wasn't a thought. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't harmless. It was a warning. And now that I had seen it, doing nothing was no longer an option. The next morning felt heavier than the ones before. Not because anything had changed on the surface, but because I had. Once your mind accepts that you might be in danger, even silence sounds different. The house didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. He noticed small things. The way I paused before answering. The way I listened instead of reacting. He didn't ask questions. He never did. He preferred observation. His concern increased after that. At least that's what it looked like from the outside. He reminded me to eat. Asked where I was going. Offered to handle things for me. Let me take care of it, he'd say calmly. You don't need to stress. And once again, control arrived wearing the mask of kindness. I realized something important then. He didn't want conflict. He wanted certainty. He wanted to know where I was, what I was thinking, how far I could go without his permission. Every correction came with scripture. Not open discussion, conclusions. If I questioned him, he didn't get angry. He grew quiet, disappointed, like I had failed a test. Then he would read. Verses about obedience. Verses about order. Verses about punishment. Never mercy. Never compassion. It was always about authority. And slowly, I understood that the Bible wasn't guiding him. He was using it to guide me. My phone rang less. Not because people stopped calling, but because answering caused tension. Why does she need to know that? Why are you sharing our business? Not everyone needs access to you. Eventually, it felt easier not to respond. Silence became the path of least resistance. And resistance, I was learning, had consequences. The walls didn't move, but my world did. Rooms felt smaller. Windows felt farther away. Even time felt controlled. Meals, sleep, prayer, conversation. Everything followed his rhythm. And every time I adjusted myself to fit into it, he seemed more satisfied. That scared me. One evening, I asked a simple question. What if I want to visit my sister next week? The room didn't change, but the air did. He didn't answer right away. He stood, walked to the shelf, picked up the Bible, and opened it without urgency. Then he read a verse about loyalty. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough. And I understood the answer. Fear is easier when it's obvious. This wasn't obvious. This was layered. Thought up. Quiet. I began to understand that whatever was written on that note wasn't sudden. It wasn't emotional. It was intentional. And intentions don't disappear on their own. I didn't pack bags. I didn't make plans out loud. I made mental maps. I learned which moments he was distracted. Which days his routine never changed. Which silences meant danger and which meant comfort. I started saving information instead of money. Because information is harder to detect, he thought he was leading. But something subtle had changed. I wasn't obeying anymore. I was complying. And there is a difference. Compliance waits. Obedience surrenders. I never took the note out again. I didn't need to. It lived in my memory now. Clear, sharp, undeniable. Every decision I made from that point forward was shaped by it. Not panic. Preparation to be why the end of that week. I knew one thing for certain. If I stayed unaware, I would stay alive for now. If I stayed silent, I could buy time. But time was not safety. And whatever I did next would have to be precise. I stopped reacting to things the way I used to. That change didn't come from confidence. Came from caution. Every word I spoke felt like it needed to pass through a filter first. Not the kind that softens things, the kind that removes risk. I measured my tone. I watched my expressions. I made sure nothing in my face betrayed what my mind was doing behind it. He noticed the calm. And he liked it. That was the dangerous part. He started trusting me again, or at least that's what it looked like. The questions became fewer. The glances shorter. The pauses less tense. That's when I understood something important. Control doesn't need force when it believes it has already won. Days passed. Then weeks. From the outside, our life probably looked better than ever. No arguments. No visible tension. Just routine. Just order. Inside, I was building something quietly. Not an escape yet. Not a plan I could name. Just awareness. I paid attention to his timing. When he left the house. How long he stayed gone. What days he returned earlier than expected. I noticed how his mood shifted depending on whether he felt respected or questioned. I learned that silence pleased him more than agreement ever had. So I stayed silent. He talked more when I talked less. That surprised me. When he felt unchallenged, he became careless. He explained things he never had before. He shared thoughts he used to keep guarded, especially during prayer. Sometimes late at night. He spoke as if I wasn't fully there. As if I was already something else. One evening he said something that stayed with me. He talked about order. About how some people exist to lead and others exist to follow. He spoke calmly, like it was a natural law, not an opinion. He nodded. Inside something hardened. Because I knew then that whatever he believed justified his control, and possibly worse, wasn't temporary. It was foundational. Sleep became difficult. Not because I was afraid he would act suddenly, but because I knew he wouldn't. People who plan don't rush. They wait until everything aligns. That thought kept me awake more than fear ever could. I started rehearsing situations in my head. What if I needed help? What if I needed to leave quickly? What if I made a mistake? I didn't write anything down. I didn't save anything on my phone. I kept everything where he couldn't reach it. In my mind, I learned how to look normal. That sounds simple, but it isn't. Looking normal means laughing at the right moments. Asking questions that don't lead anywhere. Showing interest without curiosity. It means becoming unremarkable. And I became very good at that. He grew more relaxed. Sometimes he'd place his hand on my shoulder while reading, like a reminder of presence. Not affection, possession. I didn't pull away. I didn't lean in either. Neutrality became my shield. The note never left my thoughts. Didn't replay loudly. It didn't haunt me. It waited. Like a line you cross once and can't return from. Everything before it felt distant now. like a different version of my life. By the end of that month, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. This wasn't about anger. It wasn't about impulse. It was about belief. And belief is far more dangerous. I didn't know how I would get out yet. But I knew something else just as clearly. If I stayed still for too long, someone else would decide my ending for me. The first real change happened quietly. Not in him, in me. I stopped thinking in days and started thinking in moments. Short windows of time where something could go wrong, or right. When you live with uncertainty long enough, you stop planning for comfort and start planning for survival. And survival requires patience. I began to notice how often he repeated himself. Not stories, beliefs. Certain ideas came back again and again, always framed as truth, never opinion. He spoke about purpose the way someone talks about destiny. Fixed, decided, unchangeable. When he talked like that, his eyes didn't wander. They stayed focused, like he was explaining something already settled in his mind. I listened. Not because I agreed, but because listening gave me information. There were moments when I felt almost invisible. Not ignored, overlooked. He assumed I was exactly where he had placed me. Mentally, emotionally, spiritually. That assumption gave me space. And space, I was learning, was rare. One afternoon while he was out, I stood in the middle of the living room and tried to see it the way someone else might. Nothing looked wrong. The furniture was neat. The shelf clean. The Bible still in its place. If someone walked in, they would feel calm. Safe even. That scared me more than anything else. Because it meant whatever danger existed here didn't announce itself. Blended in. It waited. I tested myself with small freedoms. Standing by the window longer than usual. Taking an extra few minutes outside. Changing the order of my routine just slightly. Each time I watched his reaction. There was none. Not because he didn't notice, but because the changes were too small to register as resistance. That's when I understood something crucial. I didn't need to break free all at once. I needed to loosen the structure quietly. At night I practiced staying calm in my own body, slowing my breathing, relaxing my hands, keeping my face neutral even when my thoughts weren't. Fear leaves traces if you let it. And traces can be noticed. I couldn't afford to be noticed. There were nights he spoke in his sleep. Not clearly. Not in full sentences. But certain words surfaced again and again. Order. Correction. Purpose. Hearing them in the dark made my skin crawl. Because people don't dream about things that don't matter to them. I thought about leaving many times. Walking out the door. Not looking back. Letting instinct take over. But instinct without preparation can be fatal. I didn't know where I would go. I didn't know who I could trust. And I didn't know how much time I really had. Leaving badly felt more dangerous than staying quietly. Now, one evening something small but important happened. He asked me a question, not about plans, not about routine. About belief. He wanted to know if I trusted his judgment completely. The way he asked it made my heart slow down instead of race. Because I knew the answer mattered. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said, I trust that you believe you're doing what's right. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. And I realized I had chosen my words perfectly. That night I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, from clarity. Because now I knew how careful I had to be. And how close I might already be to crossing a line I couldn't step back from. The note came back to me again. Not the words but the certainty behind them. Whatever had been written wasn't emotional. It wasn't symbolic. It was intentional. And intentions don't fade with time. They wait. I began preparing my mind for a possibility I hadn't fully faced yet. That I might not get a warning. That the moment to act might come suddenly. That hesitation could cost me everything. So I practiced readiness. Mentally. Quietly. Constantly. By the end of that phase, one truth had settled deep inside me. I wasn't just living with someone I didn't trust anymore. I was living inside a belief system that had already decided my role. And if I wanted to survive, I would have to step outside of it, without letting it know. The opportunity didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no warning, no dramatic moment, no clear signal telling me this is it. It came disguised as something ordinary. Small shift in routine. He mentioned a meeting one evening. Nothing unusual about that. He talked about it casually, the way he talked about everything he believed was already decided. He said he'd be gone longer than usual, that the schedule might run late. He nodded. Inside something sharpened. Not excitement. Not relief. Focus. That night I didn't sleep much. Not because I was afraid of what might happen, but because I was afraid of missing the moment. When you've been waiting quietly for something to change, you learn that hesitation is louder than fear. I went over everything in my head again. What I knew. What I didn't. What I could carry. What I would have to leave behind. I reminded myself of one thing over and over. I don't need certainty. I need distance. The next morning felt unusually calm. He moved through the house with his normal precision. Breakfast. Prayer. Few routine comments. Nothing in his voice suggested suspicion. Nothing in his behavior suggested urgency. That almost made me doubt myself again. Almost. When he left, I didn't move right away. I stayed where I was. I listened. The door closed. His footsteps faded. The sound of the car disappeared down the street. Only then did I breathe. Not deeply. Not dramatically. Just enough to steady myself. I didn't rush. That was important. Rushing creates mistakes. And mistakes leave traces. I walked through the house slowly, touching nothing I didn't need to. Checked the clock. Checked the windows. I checked the door again, locked just the way he liked it. Predictable. I stood in the living room and looked at the shelf. The Bible was still there. For a moment I thought about taking it. Not out of anger. Not out of defiance. It was proof. But something told me to leave it exactly where it was. Some things are safer untouched. Packed lightly. Not a suitcase. Not a bag that would look intentional. Just essentials. Documents. Is enough to give myself options. I didn't take anything sentimental. Survival doesn't make room for nostalgia. As I moved, I noticed something unexpected. I wasn't shaking. My hands were steady. My thoughts clear. Fear had already done its job earlier. It had taught me caution. What remained now wasn't fear. It was resolve. Paused near the door. That was the moment that mattered. The one where doubt usually speaks up. Where questions try to pull you backward. Where comfort argues for staying just a little longer. None of that came. What came instead was a quiet certainty. If I don't leave now, I may not get another chance. Open the door. The sound felt loud, even though it wasn't. I stepped outside and closed it behind me carefully, making sure it locked the same way it always did. Routine preserved. As I walked away from the house, I didn't look back. Not because I was brave, but because looking back invites hesitation. And hesitation was something I couldn't afford anymore. I didn't have a destination. Had direction. Way. Every step felt unreal, like I was moving through a version of my life that didn't belong to me yet. The world outside felt wider than I remembered. No walls. No schedule. No voice telling me where I should be. To space. I kept walking until I reached a place where I could stop without being noticed. Only then did the weight hit me. Not panic. Relief. The kind that comes when your body realizes you're no longer confined. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if he would notice right away. I didn't know how he would react. I didn't know what consequences might follow. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened after this moment would happen on the other side of that door. And I was no longer behind it. By the time I sat down and allowed myself to think again, the truth was clear. Leaving wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a different kind of danger. One I could face. Because I had already chosen myself. The first thing I noticed after leaving was how loud the world felt. Not with noise but with choice. Cars passed. People walked by. Conversations happened without lowering their voices. No one knew who I was. No one knew where I had come from. And for the first time in a long time, that anonymity felt safer than familiarity ever had. I sat still for a while, letting my breathing slow down on its own. My body was catching up to a decision my mind had already made. I didn't call anyone right away. That was intentional. I needed distance before explanation, space before emotion. If I spoke too soon, fear might leak into my voice, and fear invites questions. So I waited. I watched the time instead. Minutes passed. And more. Nothing happened. And that silence told me something important. I had more time than I thought. Eventually I moved again. Carefully. Without pattern. I avoided familiar places. Avoided routes he would expect. I chose movement over direction. Staying aware of my surroundings without appearing alert. I blended in. That skill came easier than I expected. When I finally made the first call, my voice surprised me. It was steady. Not emotional. Not rushed. I asked for help without explaining everything. I didn't need to justify myself yet. I just needed somewhere safe to land. The answer came faster than I expected. Yes. That single word carried more weight than any prayer I had whispered in that house. The place I arrived at wasn't special. It didn't need to be. It was quiet, neutral, temporary. And temporary was enough. I sat down and allowed myself to feel something for the first time since leaving. Not fear, grief. Not for him, but for the version of myself that had stayed quiet for so long, believing silence was the same as peace. As the hours passed, reality began to settle. Leaving didn't erase danger. Shifted it. Now there were questions I couldn't answer yet. Decisions that would have consequences. A future that was suddenly undefined. But uncertainty outside felt lighter than certainty inside ever had. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. That worried me more than an immediate reaction would have. People who panic act fast. People who plan don't. I reminded myself of that and stayed grounded. That night, sleep came in short waves. I woke up often, listening for sounds that weren't there. Every unfamiliar noise made my body tense before my mind could reassure it. Freedom doesn't arrive quietly. Takes time to feel real. In the morning, the first message appeared. Short, controlled, asking where I was. No anger. No urgency. Just expectation. I didn't reply. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that responding too soon would put me back into a pattern I had already stepped out of. Silence this time belonged to me. I spent the day thinking. Not about going back. Not about confronting him. About next steps. Legal. Practical. Personal. Leaving had removed me from immediate danger. Not from consequence. I needed to think clearly now more than ever. As evening came, I realized something unexpected. Felt stronger. Not confident. Not fearless. But grounded. I had made one irreversible decision already. Whatever came next would build on that. I didn't know how this would end yet. But I knew how it wouldn't. I would not return to a life where obedience was mistaken for faith and silence was mistaken for virtue. That chapter was closed, even if the story wasn't finished. The messages didn't stop after that. They stayed controlled, measured, almost polite. He asked where I was. He asked if I was safe. He reminded me of responsibility. There was no apology in his words. No confusion. Just expectation. The same quiet assumption that I would eventually return to where he believed I belonged. That's when I understood something clearly. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about the disruption. I didn't respond. Each hour of silence felt heavier than the last, but it also felt necessary. I needed to let the space grow wide enough that I could think without his voice shaping my thoughts. When you've lived under constant guidance, learning to trust your own judgment feels unfamiliar, almost dangerous. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. Eventually, I spoke to someone who listened without interrupting. I didn't tell the story dramatically. I didn't embellish. I didn't rush. I explained it the way it had unfolded, Slowly, quietly, piece by piece. The note, the control, the belief system, the fear that never announced itself out loud. When I finished, there was a pause. Then they said something simple. You did the right thing. That sentence didn't solve anything, but it anchored me. Practical steps followed. Not all at once. Not perfectly. Safety first. Then distance. Then protection. I learned how many systems exist for people who leave quietly. How much help is available once you stop pretending everything is fine. That knowledge changed how alone I felt. He tried a different approach after that. The messages softened. Reminders of shared history. Faith. Vows. He framed my leaving as confusion. As weakness. As something temporary that could be corrected. Reading those words, I realized how carefully he avoided one thing. Responsibility. There was no acknowledgement of harm. No curiosity about why I left. Just a focus on restoring order. And that confirmed what I already knew. I thought about the Bible often during that time. Not with anger. With clarity. Faith had never been the problem. Control had. And control doesn't disappear just because you step away from it. It looks for new ways to reach you. That's why distance matters. Not just physical, mental. The days passed and something unexpected happened. The fear began to loosen. Not vanish, just soften. I slept longer. Breathed deeper. I caught myself making choices without second-guessing whether they would be approved. That freedom felt unfamiliar. And precious. There was no dramatic confrontation. No final argument. Just a slow, undeniable shift in power. I stopped responding. I stopped explaining. I stopped negotiating my safety. And without an audience, his words lost their weight. I don't know what he believes now. I don't know how he explains my absence to himself. But I know this. My life no longer exists inside his version of the story. It exists in mine. Looking back, the most dangerous part wasn't the note. It was how easily I had been convinced to doubt myself before I ever found it. That's what control does. It makes silence feel righteous. Makes obedience feel moral. Makes survival feel selfish. Until one moment breaks the illusion. I didn't leave because I was brave. I left because I finally listened to the part of me that had been warning me quietly for a long time. And that part saved my life. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to understand, it's this. Danger doesn't always shout. Sometimes it prays. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it waits patiently for you to stop trusting yourself. Don't. My story didn't end the day I walked out that door. But the part where I was trapped did. And that made everything that came after possible.